Welcome to everyone who's joining us in this webinar. This is the Post-Pandemic Challenges in Asia. And a warm welcome to our panelists as well. We are live now via Zoom and also on Facebook. So for the purposes of this webinar, I would just like to inform everyone that this session will be recorded. And before we begin, the Asia Institute, University of Melbourne respectfully acknowledges the traditional owners of the land in which we are holding this webinar, the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung, and Bunurong peoples of the Eastern Kulin, and pays respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. My name is Anne-Lise Arese from the Asia Institute, and today I would like to introduce our moderator, Professor Mark Wang. Professor Mark is the director of the Center for Contemporary Chinese Studies at the Asia Institute and also professor in the School of Geography at the University of Melbourne. Mark will be introducing our panelists today. Mark, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. Thank you. First, welcome audience to another Melbourne Asian Review webinar. As you know, Dr. Jay Song and myself serve as a guest editor for the Melbourne Asian Review edition 11. This edition is about post-COVID social environmental challenges in Asia. Jay and I identified this theme for Melbourne Asian Review because the COVID-19 pandemic has substantially impacted our way of life, work, everything for more than 2 years, and has forced us to rethink how we deal with the issues about economic, social, health, environmental challenges ahead. This webinar will cover the pandemic effects on politics, society, and environment in Asia and Australia. And we invite 3 authors among the 11 who are the key contributors to this edition to share their key findings with you. So let's start. I will ask each speaker to give about 10 minutes presentation. During their presentation, please write your questions, comments in the chat box at any time. We will bring them up during the Q&A session. I will ask them to speak. First, the speaker, let me introduce, is Dr. Sylvia Ang, who is the lecturer Sociology at Monash University. Actually, after receiving her PhD from Melbourne University, Sylvia was a Alfred Deakin postdoc research fellows and then postdoc fellow in National University Singapore, and now is lecturer in sociology in Monash University. Her research about migrants in and from Asia, with a quite interesting focus on ethnic relations, class, gender, postcolonialism, and decolonization. She has published many books in good top journals, such as Journal of Ethics and Migration Studies, Mobility, Ethics, Racial Studies. Her recent book about contesting Chineseness is Nationality, Class, Gender, New Chinese Migrants. It's a new book, 2022, by Amsterdam University Press. So it's a quite an interesting topic and quite an interesting publication background. Now, the floor is yours, Sylvia.
Thanks, Mark, for your introduction and also for moderating this webinar. And thanks, Anne, for your organization of this webinar. My name is Sylvia Ang, like Mark has introduced. Before I start, I also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the unceded lands on which I live and work, the Woiwurrung and Bunurong peoples of the Kulin nations. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Now I'm going to share my screen. Can you see my screen fine? I think you can see my screen, but I've lost something. Hang on just a moment.
Yeah. Hey, perfect.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Mark. I will talk to you today about pandemic racism and sexism in Australia. So this is a really a piece of journal article that I worked with Dr. Jay Song at the University of Melbourne and Dr. Chu Ping Pan at Shenzhen Technology University. So I'm just presenting this on behalf of myself and my co-authors. Okay, so with this paper, we since the COVID-19 pandemic, as Mark discussed, really there have been studies that have emerged on its effect on either racism or sexism. Studies that address the intersection of pandemic-related racism and sexism are really lacking, and experiences of Asian women have been neglected. So with my co-authors and we address these gaps by drawing on interviews with Asian women in late 2021 last year in Australia, Victoria. And we investigated really 3 points: how Asian women in Australia experienced racism, their experiences of racism, and how it intersects with sexism. And finally, how do they make sense of their experiences, and how do they see themselves responding to future incidents? And through this investigation, we argued 3 points. The lack of attention to Asian women's pandemic-related experiences of racism obscures the fact that Asian women encounter racism more than their male counterparts. We also argue that the lack of attention to how sexism intersects with Asian women's experiences of racism makes it more difficult for them to make sense of their experiences. And this potentially prevents mistreatment from continuing. And finally, our third argument is that participants' reflections show that there is potential for women of color in general to form coalitions based on sharing intersectionality. And we hope really this paper can offer some insights for feminist and anti-racist studies and initiatives. Just a quick look at the method for this paper. We interviewed 19 self-identified Asian female migrants and 1 Australian-born woman of Asian heritage for the project. Participants were aged between 21 and 49. Most are highly educated, having obtained a minimum of a tertiary level diploma. And participants originate from really a number of places, as you can see over there, including New Zealand, UK, China, India, Malaysia, Nepal, Singapore, South Korea, Sri Lanka, Japan, Cambodia, and Taiwan. All names used in this article are pseudonyms. Okay, so I will be showing the slides with some of these narratives, but I won't be reading them. I'll be focusing on discussing the findings of the paper. So the participants had a wide range of experiences of racism and sexism in Australia. Some report no experience at all, while others report to the extreme of physical attacks. 8 out of 20 participants experienced racially motivated verbal or physical abuse during the pandemic. And 14 out of 20 participants discussed their experiences of sexism as Asian women living in Australia before and during the pandemic. Now, the study's participants believe that women were targeted more than men by racists. And I think what is particular about our findings is really we set out to ask participants about their experiences of racism during the pandemic, but what we got from them was frequently the expression of anxieties, not only about racism, but also about sexual harassment and gender-related violence. Some experiences they discussed include being sexualized in online, offline harassment. And my co-authors and I frequently sensed an inability among participants to articulate their experiences in terms of racism and its intersection with sexism. So participants frequently use weird or strange to describe their perpetrators or experiences. You can see some narratives here from some of our participants. The insecurity they felt during the pandemic intensified due to an increase in harassment, as they tell us. Their experiences suggest that Asian women could be more vulnerable or feel more vulnerable to racism and sexism. Their experiences are tightly linked to their positionality as Asian women. Their appearances are stereotyped by others such that they seem like easy targets, whether sexually and or racially. However, unlike other studies, such as one which found that Aboriginal interviewees in Australia generally agreed that it was good to confront a racist perpetrator, most of our participants expressed otherwise. As Asian women, most participants felt they were vulnerable to perpetrators, whether due to their small size or looking youthful. Stereotypes of Asian women as weak and submissive, as well as cultural preferences to avoid confrontation, also made our participants feel more vulnerable. However, participants reflected that they are just as vulnerable to racism as other minority women. Now, other than report future incidents though, participants focused on their avoidance strategies rather than things they could proactively do to tackle racism and sexism. So for example, some participants talked about how they will go supermarket shopping at certain times of the day to avoid crowds or to avoid who they think are more dangerous potential perpetrators. We argue that this lack of action, lack of proactive action, is linked to the inability to understand and identify their experiences as intersecting racism and sexism. Now, racism frequently intersects with sexism. Lots of studies have already established this, right? However, studies on the intersectionality of racism with sexism often neglects this very interesting phenomenon called racial fetish, which is one's preference for sexual intimacy with people of a specific racial group. A prime example is yellow fever. I'm sure some of you have heard of this, right? Where Asian women, and in some cases men, are preferred mostly by white people due to highly sexualized stereotypes of being seductive and or submissive. We argue that the stereotypes of Asian women as weak and submissive underline their supposed attractiveness while positioning them as easy targets for hostility. Now, Associate Professor Fran Martin recently published a great book, and in her study of Chinese female trans migrants in Australia, she talked about how her participants fear assault, and their fears were really connected to the sense, I quote, that East Asian looking young women could become sexual targets for non-Asian men with stereotyped preconceptions of their desirability as partners, unquote. So Fran's participants also felt they were more vulnerable to attacks due to, I quote, supposedly being smaller, weaker, and more defenseless than either white women or Chinese men, unquote. With our study, we find Asian women frequently struggle with their experiences of racism and sexism while exerting significant emotional labor to understand and negotiate their experiences. They experience hermeneutical injustice, which means, I quote, wherein someone has a significant area of their social experience obscured from understanding, owing to prejudicial flaws in shared resources for social interpretation, unquote. Now, this is a marginalization that is driven by a white-centered experience that neglects racial dynamics from other perspectives. The inability to make sense of one's ongoing mistreatment prevents one from protesting it and finding measures to stop it. So what we think really is that activist campaigns during the pandemic, and there are many, right? Lots of hashtags that has emerged, share similarities with studies on pandemic racism in their lack of attention to intersectionality. Campaigns in Australia and abroad during the pandemic have focused mainly on racism against culturally and linguistically diverse people, or violence against women, right? Not and, but all. And little attention has been paid to how a specific group of women experience the pandemic. Okay, now I'm ending. Returning to concerns voiced by intersectional scholars that much intersectionality research has moved away from activism and group-based approaches centering women of color, we argue that the focus on intersectional experiences of Asian women must grow, right? Only when such experiences and the focus on them grow, can we enable victims to have shared resources for social interpretation. Only when their social experiences are not obscured by white-centered experiences can they identify, protest, and stop mistreatment. The ability to identify their intersectional experiences will also foster greater potential for solidarity with other women of color in a post-COVID future. Thank you, and that's my email and Twitter if you want to ask more questions and don't have time to. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you very much. This is a very interesting topic. I mean, we only give you 10, 15 minutes, but actually this is one of a topic, could be the whole hour's discussion about the pandemic, racism, and sexism. It's a wonderful topic. Thank you. And I believe we're just waiting for some of the questions. We can answer some of the questions later. So I will move to the second speaker.
Thanks, Mark.
Second speaker is Theo Manders, and who is our a PhD candidate at the Asia Institute at Melbourne University, and he's also Melbourne Climate Future Academy, also part of Melbourne University. His research focus applying non-traditional security theory, game theory, to the case study about Australia, Korea, South Korea green hydrogen collaboration. His dissertation is something like the title, something like Hunting Hydrogen, a wonderful topic. Australia, South Korea collaboration and a few of the future. It sounds like a fascinating topic. Before joining Melbourne University, he was undergraduate student as researcher at the University of West Australia, where he researched representation of Asia in Australia education policy. So Phil, it's your turn, your floor.
Thank you, Mark, for that introduction. And hello to everyone watching. So my topic today, I'm just going to share my slides quickly. Is that visible to everyone? Perfect. Okay. So my topic today is a little bit, well, quite different actually from the topic before me. My article for MAR looked at sustainable recoveries and the energy transition post-COVID-19, with a specific focus on South Korea and Australia and how they responded to this question of how to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic in an economic sense. So I'd just like to start with a little bit of background to this article. So as we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic had a very severe and significant impact on the global economy. This graph shows GDP growth globally from the 1990s to 2021. And it's very clear to see here that the COVID recession was more severe than the GFC, which is that spike in the middle there, and also recessions such as the Asian financial crisis and in the early 2000s as well. So we had this situation with COVID where there was this extremely severe economic downturn as a result of lockdowns and other measures taken to stop the spread of the virus, which at the same time kind of created this sentiment in people, or this awareness in people, of the relationship between economic growth and environmental degradation in a way that hadn't really been addressed previously. So on the internet, one of the kind of trends for people to post was photos of nature kind of reclaiming spaces that were almost exclusively used by humans before the pandemic, like, you know, penguins crossing highways and that kind of thing. And they were often captioned with something like nature is healing or we are the virus, referring to the fact that humans have a very significant impact on the environment. So there's this was an article from BuzzFeed talking about it, and a example of someone parodying the trend, showing the universal logo in the sky because the air is so clear. So while these come across as jokes or they get ridiculed, the importance of it, at least for this topic and the relationship between economic growth and environmental sustainability, is that for the first time, that relationship was being negotiated in real time. So people could very clearly see that as economic activity slowed, nature was indeed healing. So that made, or this is another example here as well, the David Attenborough documentary that came out on Apple TV Plus in 2021 called The Year the Earth Changed, which looks at how nature was impacted by the economic downturn associated with COVID. So this immediacy of this issue, or of economic and environmental issues kind of coming into tension with each other, it made the question of how do we recover from the pandemic economically an even more pressing one, because people were acutely aware of the relationship between economic growth and environmental degradation. So my article for MAR sort of looked at this question from two perspectives, one being Australia and the other one being South Korea. And what I'm going to do now is just break down those two approaches a little bit more and sort of look at what there is that other countries can learn specifically from South Korea's approach, because it was the more robust approach out of the two. So South Korea has taken what I would call a very pro-climate approach to the COVID-19 economic recovery. And this was really rooted in the country's history of overcoming similar crises, such as the post-Korean War reconstruction period in the 1950s and the Asian financial crisis recovery in the 1990s. So the backbone of the COVID recovery approach is the Korean New Deal, obviously an homage to the New Deal in America in the 1940s, which aimed to reform three key areas of the Korean economy, being digital services and technologies, better social safety nets, and most relevant here as well, green industry and clean technologies. So this is not a new approach for Korea. It wasn't necessarily a pivot in the traditional sense, in that Korea has a long-running tradition of advocating for green growth, both domestically and abroad. And by green growth, I'm referring to, and what Korea refers to, is the idea that economic growth can indeed be decoupled from carbon emissions, so that an increase in economic growth does not necessarily mean an increase in emissions and pollution. Korea founded the Global Green Growth Institute in 2010, and it's been advocating for the policy in international fora since at least the mid-2000s. So this is something that's evolved from a very long-standing approach to this issue. So what South Korea really did in this situation is they looked at the COVID-19 recovery and they saw an opportunity to effectively build green growth from the ground up by using the recession as an opportunity to invest heavily in new and emerging industries in order to retool the national economy and restructure it towards cleaner and more fair growth. So that contrasts quite starkly to the Australian approach. If we think about it as a spectrum, if Korea sits at one end, then Australia sits pretty much at the opposite end of the spectrum. The Liberal National government that ran Australia during the pandemic very vocally advocated for a gas-fired recovery. And the government very vocally committed to providing a future for fossil fuels in Australia in some form. There was very little interest from the government in using the economic crisis as an opportunity to tackle climate change meaningfully through an economic plan. And this, when we look at the recent history of Australia, this really isn't surprising, given that climate change has been a particularly politically fraught issue in the country. All 6 of the leadership transitions from 2008 to 2022 involved climate tensions in some way, whether it was through a leadership spill inside a party or external kind of election politics. There was always climate running through the agenda. And the reason for that really is quite simple, in that Australia is very unique in its relationship with climate change. On the one hand, Australia is one of the driest continents on Earth, and it's at an increased risk of fires, floods, droughts, and other extreme weather events. But on the other hand, the country's recent economic history has been defined by a massive commodities boom that has seen Australia become the world's largest producer of coal and a major supplier of other fossil fuels. So what this has created is a really serious tension in Australia between economic and environmental goals. It's very hard for politicians or really anyone looking at this issue closely to separate these two things, because it's often seen that making concessions to one means sacrificing something for the other. And in recent history, that balance has always meant favouring economic growth over the environment. So I'd like to kind of wrap this up with just a look at where the two countries are now and what this means for the future of their approaches to this issue. So both countries have had recent elections in the last few months. However, looking at what happened during and after these two elections can offer some lessons that Australia could take from Korea in how to approach this issue in the future. So in Korea, a conservative government was elected with President Yoon Suk-yeol becoming president. And during the campaign, he made comments such as 100% renewable energy doesn't make any sense. And he was also a strong advocate for increasing South Korea's nuclear power generation, or the share of nuclear power that makes up the energy mix in Korea. Despite this, however, he remained committed throughout the entire campaign and now in office as well to Korea's net zero by 2050 target. And what this really speaks to is the country's success in making climate change a national rather than a partisan issue. The candidates in the South Korean election debated how the goal of emissions reduction should be achieved, not whether such a goal is necessary at all. And that's fundamentally different from Australia, where the question has almost always been, should we be addressing climate change at all? In the Australian case of this year's election, the centre-left Albanese government was elected with a pledge to increase emissions targets and get the country on track to meet its requirements under the 2015 Paris Accord. On election night, the new Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, proclaimed that his victory meant that the climate wars of Australia were coming to an end. And in a sense, he has a point in that he replaced the government that was dragged kicking and screaming to COP26 conference in Glasgow with a net zero target. And the opposition party still remains divided on that net zero goal. So what the lesson is really here for Albanese and Australia more generally, is that if we agree with his statement that the climate wars in Australia are indeed over, then there's a real need to use the next few years to depoliticize the climate change debate and cast it instead as an opportunity for Australia to embrace green growth, or embrace a policy platform that has the potential to create green growth. It's been heavily documented and it's talked about a lot at the moment that Australia has significant clean energy generation potential. And this is evidenced by Albanese's own comments that he wants Australia to become a clean energy superpower. And what Australia can do here is try and use this debate of clean energy superpower status and those kind of things to look at how the country can get there rather than if it's necessary to get there at all. If Australia can do this and kind of retool this debate towards a more inclusive and holistic approach to economic growth and environmental issues, Australia and Korea would become even more aligned in their approaches to these two issues. And this is a positive given, which is what my PhD research focuses on. There's clear compatibilities between Australia and Korea when it comes to emerging clean energy technologies such as hydrogen, and also critical minerals such as lithium that are integral in the production of battery technologies and so forth. And there's an opportunity for Australia to really embrace its clean energy superpower role by collaborating with like-minded countries such as Korea in order to build these industries from the ground up and take a leaf out of the Korean approach in order to do that. So that's my talk. I look forward to any questions. Thank you.
Great. And another interesting topic, climate change, international collaboration is wonderful issues. We will have more time to talk about your topics and leave the last 20 minutes or something for that. And the final speaker, which is not about country to country level, more ground level, social workers. The final speaker is another one. The Wang family is the largest family name in the world.
Definitely.
It's Lei Han Wang, who is the current new PhD student of Asian Institute, Monash University. Her research interest related to national identity, history, education, political sociology, grassroots movement, governance in China, and more precisely about Chinese social work. Her PhD research is about the reconstruction of national identity in the post-colonial era based on historical education system in Hong Kong and Macau. But he published the book, one publication is called something called What Did Chinese Social Worker Do at the Worst Moment? Basically, it's a research based on social workers' participation in fight against the COVID-19 and Guangzhou city, capital city of Guangdong province. So quite interesting, which is public but social work in public health. Today, I think her presentation was related to this, right? Your turn. Right.
Yeah. Oh, thanks, Mark, for introducing me. Good afternoon, everyone. It is my great honor to be here to share some thoughts about how the situation of the grassroots personnel in China at the pandemic time. Well, in this article, I will take social workers as an example. Actually, as Mark has introduced, my research focus is actually on national identity and history education. The reason why I want to do some research on this aspect is because my best friend is currently a grassroots civil servant in government. In COVID period, she was so tired and exhausted. So I decided to do some research on it, and also my major in my undergraduate study is social work. That inspired me to do some research on it. Thus, my undergraduate supervisor and I cooperate to write a paper on the situation of Chinese social worker in COVID-19. Well, the articles in MAR briefly introduced how Chinese social worker stuck between the government and the people. In the prevention and control of the pandemic, on the one hand, when pandemic break out in one specific place, the grassroots personnel in that place actually will take full responsibility to provide service to the people and also implement the policies. As the final implementers of the governance policies, the grassroots personnel, such as social workers, always work all days and all nights without rest. Their routine job, including measuring the temperature of the people and also delivering food and living material to the residents, and also helping arrange the quarantine, etc. Many things they have to do. According to our survey, over 18% of the social workers should measuring the temperature for the residents, and over 19% should distribute material to the resident every day. Besides this kind of routine job, actually social workers has their own professional jobs such as casework and group work, but actually when we do the research, they have a very limited time to do this. This is a rather long story. Maybe I don't have that time to share all of these things in 10 minutes. Anyway, these people are actually physically and mentally exhausted. A more serious problem is the lack of reward. Because of the long-term pandemic in China and in the world, the corresponding finance problem, many of them can only receive the very basic wage without any performance salary, or not to say any rewards of their additional work at even they will work on weekends, or they will work at night. They will not be paid. That is a very important dimension we discussed in our paper. Well, on the other hand, as both a service provider and also the policy implementer, grassroots personnel face pressure from both top to down dimension from the government and also the bottom to up dimension from the community. Besides providing the daily service to the community, like I have listed, they have also have to fulfill their politic role of implementing and populating the government policies. During the pandemic, they should take the responsibility to balance the individual requirement and also the instructions from the government. Still takes the social workers in Guangzhou as an example. The surveys in 2020 shows that over 98% of them should help distribute the public health policies and information every day. And also almost all of them should fulfill the routine documents and also report to the government every day. That is their routine job. Well, it is a highly stressful because the bridge, being the bridge between the citizens and the government, well, to avoid being polished from not doing enough. Actually, this grassroots personnel always implemented the policies, especially the zero COVID policy and the long-term policy in China is maintaining the stability. The zero COVID policy is actually ordered to achieve at all costs, even now in China, which leaves very narrow space for the social workers to mediate with the residents. And actually this brings some tensions between the citizens and the grassroots personnel. For example, the one-size-fits-all quarantine policy has caused many arguments between the residents and also the service providers. These people who need special consideration, like the disability people and also the elder people, are regarded as the same with other normal people. That makes many problems in this process. Indeed, this policy was effective at the very beginning of the pandemic, but 3 years has passed. If still use the one-size-fits-all policy, yeah, it is still a question. But if we look at the social media recently or the newspaper maybe not, in social media, you can feel the anger from the people. And also you can feel the related financial crisis that brought by this policy. It is not only makes the situation of social workers harder and more difficult, but also threatens the governance of China. Well, as the main actors in both the level of state governance and social governance, grassroots personnel is facing great pressure, and they actually need more support from both system level and also the institution level to help them balance the implementation of the policy and the service provision. How to properly locate the grassroots personnel between the public and the government is actually a test for Chinese grassroots governance system. Especially China has presented the concept of the modernization of governance ability and governance system. Well, as a very basic governance system area, it is worth for Chinese government to establish and complete a supportive system, and as well as some policies to help locate and support these grassroots personnel. Yeah, that's all. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much for the case study about the social workers and during the COVID-19 the experience. I believe you have a lot detailed story to share.
Yeah.
If you give some more time, it's quite a
Yeah.
fascinating topic as well. Okay, now it's time for question and answer, Q&A. Can we let the audience say what, I don't know how to do. And can we, yeah, I saw some question already. Can we bring them in to see the face rather than just ask question? You don't know who's asked question. I can tell. Very raised some question. Very long question. Oh, good. That's great. Thank you, very. Okay, wait. Let's start. Phil, do you want to address some issues very raised and quite a fascinating story about the green staff careers? Do you want to start?
Yeah.
If some of the question, you know, but obviously, we try to give more big picture. It's quite interesting stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Let me just quickly summarize what Vedi has put in the chat here. So he's talking about a study recently that showed that out of the Green New Deal budget of 50 trillion Korean won, the largest share was allocated to the controversial 4 major rivers restoration project, as well as to the expansion of nuclear power plants. And also that there's been, the study found a few issues with how Korea classifies green jobs and how those actually break down in practice, as well as other overestimates of employment in green industries in previous years as well. And also, a 2015 study that found that jobs in green industry have only risen 1% between 2008 to 2015. And the share of renewable sources in energy generation grew only 2.2% in the decade from 2006 to 2016, which is well below the country's 2030 goal of 11%. And there was also no significant reduction in coal dependence over this period. I hope I didn't miss anything critical there. So yeah, look, and I did address this a little bit more in my full article that I wrote for Melbourne Asia Review, but I think it's a really good point to call out, is that Korea's approach to this is far from perfect. And I don't think we should be holding up Korea as the gold standard just because they've got a plan and they've said what they're going to do. I think, you know, based on what I've, my own research and then my own perspective on this, I think there's 2 approaches that you can take to looking at this issue. The first is the more critical view that green growth as a whole is a failed objective. It's not something we should be aiming for. This is quite widely shared among economists and others that just think that it's physically not possible to expand the size of anything. I mean, if we think about the laws of physics, it's physically impossible to expand the size of an entity without also expanding the amount of energy it consumes. So eventually, even if you can make economic growth extremely efficient, there'll become a point where you get to a tipping point where you become so efficient that that leads to more growth, and that increase in growth then leads to an increase in consumption of resources. So there's a call for new economic objectives within this, that we need to stop thinking about economic growth as a central objective and start thinking about welfare or environmental sustainability and those kind of things instead. The other way you can look at it is that Korea is one of the only examples that we have of a country that is actually trying to tackle this relationship between economic growth and environmental degradation head on. Whether or not that's perfect is sort of a secondary question to that. But when we look at what other countries are doing, there's just no one doing it at the same level or looking at it with the same intensity as Korea. So I think that there is a need to hold countries and governments accountable for how they approach these issues and how specific they are. An example in Korea is that even when Korea was announcing this New Deal in 2020, they were still financing overseas coal-fired power plants. And that was something that received a lot of activist attention in South Korea at the time. And that led to the president of Korea, Moon Jae-in, at the time, announced at the climate summit that Joe Biden convened shortly after coming to power in America. Moon Jae-in announced there that Korea would no longer finance overseas coal projects. So what we need is engagement at all levels, I think. We need government, business, and the activist and local subnational level to be approaching this issue head on and thinking, how can we make this better in different ways? And that's why I also think international collaboration is so important, because we can help to, or countries can sort of work together to look at where is this working, where is this not working, how can we improve the way that we account for these things? Because at the moment, Korea doesn't have any standard to compare itself to because it's the only one doing it. So I think that's where we can start with this, and yeah, sort of work towards a point where, you know, Korea is easy. It's easier for Korea to increase the amount of renewable energy it's using because everybody's using renewable energy and prices are coming down, and et cetera, et cetera. So I hope that answers your question.
That's good. Let's move on. Any questions for other speakers? Yeah, maybe I can ask a question about for the first speaker, Sylvia. You mentioned the pandemic racism and sexism, particular female, Asian female. You demonstrated quite an interesting reason, factor contribute why female suffer more than Asian male. Some of the reason explained. I just wonder, in yours, among the sample, surveyed, interviewed Asian female, any factor related to their background, like a different country of people from China, Chinese speaker, Indonesia speaker, or other speaker, Asian, different country background matters, or the education level matter in terms of degree of suffering or handle the capacity to handle the harassment or racist attack or sexist attack. So any internal variation fact, rather than treat them the same group, or they suffer, that's true. But are they factors or can be shared about their experience, how they handle the racist, pandemic racist? Yeah.
Right, thanks for your question, Mark. It's a really good question. Well, I think because the incidence of racism that they have experience, and also harassment, right, whether it's online or offline harassment, is based on appearances. So there is no the perpetrators do not distinguish whether what nationality they are, or how highly educated they are. And we already know from our sample that they are actually highly educated with a minimum of a diploma. So that hasn't mattered. It's really more the visibility that they look Asian. So it's not just East Asian as well, because like I shared, one of the participants is Ditya, is from Nepal. So she's more on the darker side. So she also did experience racism, verbal abuse, and things like that. So this study itself actually didn't show that there is much differentiation, or if any, in terms of the experiences due to nationality or education. But I might actually just quickly talk about my other research, which I actually started doing with ABCs, Australian born Chinese. And I found it interesting that some of my Australian-born Chinese participants actually felt that they were in a better position to handle racism than newly arrived migrants. So they will say things like, oh, we know the language, we know what's microaggressions, we don't take bullshit because we grew up in Australia, not like how the newly arrived migrants may not understand the context, may not understand microaggressions, or they, because of the lack of language, they will take microaggressions, or they don't understand microaggressions. So that is actually something interesting I'm going into with my newer research. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Well, look, here's another question from Betty. Betty is a good student, actually, good audience. For Lei Han, can you also address the issues as the
maybe I will address questions from Sylvia first. Actually, as I have mentioned, the casework and group work in China, it's still their professional work for Chinese social worker, but actually, in the situation of pandemic, they actually has limited time to do this. That is also the reason, one of the reasons why people in the community will complain that they would not provide enough professional work for them, especially in Guangzhou. And the background is Guangzhou actually has developed a social work field than any other province in China. But even in this case, Guangzhou is still very, the social workers in Guangzhou is very struggling to provide their professional service to the community. And you have, as I have mentioned, the reward. Actually, the extra work of the social worker will never be rewarded. They will still receive their very basic wage. As I have mentioned in my paper, there is a concept in China is sacrifice. People will use this kind of concept, to make them to voluntarily provide the service to the community. That is one of the reasons that why they are not rewarded, and also there is also not a systematic policy to support them, to give them rewards. And the last question is about how the development of Chinese social worker now. If before the pandemic, actually this field is a developing area. The reason why is in 2018, I think, in the report from the Prime Minister Li Keqiang, he specifically mentioned social work in the service industry at that time, and he thinks it is a very important industry in the future China. And at that time, actually, the development of Chinese social worker actually faced very big opportunity. But because of the pandemic, everything seems stopped for a while, for 3 years. And actually, I have, my friend and I are trying to establish a social work institute in China currently, and we know that there are many supportive policy and also funding for establishing social work institution now. We can apply for it, but the process will be much harder under this situation. That's all the information I know now. I hope I this answers has answered your questions.
Well, another question is actually is also fascinating. Questions about all us wondering why older people are less vaccinated than many other countries. In the West, the high vaccination rate among the older people, but in Chinese society, quite relatively lower. So, do your interviewees have information on the reason why lower rates of vaccination among elderly? Is it the older people believe something, or is a policy? Is why?
Firstly, I I don't know where is data from that older people were less vaccinated than other countries. Yeah, and yeah, now actually when I do my interviews, I didn't mention this dimension. Sorry, I think maybe I can't answer this question very from a very academic dimension. But I also wondering where can we get this result that older people were less vaccinated than others?
It was reported that, like, generally speaking,
Okay.
older people in China have a lower rate of vaccination. I think that was reported.
Okay,
yeah.
maybe I need to read it.
yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm not. I didn't read it. Yeah.
I guess the reason perhaps either related, is it the policy or it's the older people that believe that you know, or is availability.
But as far as I know, actually the government will use some measures to make all the people get to get vaccinated. Still take my friend's example. I think last year their leaders has asked them to use all the ways to make more people get vaccinated. Therefore, he paid for 200 yuan for every person to make them vaccinated. And at that time, he has contacted 2 elder people at that time to get vaccinated. That is a way I know, but I don't know why they refuse to to vaccinate it.
Yeah, that's good. I guess the major issue in China is the question we start. Everybody waiting for where is the end of a zero COVID policy after the 20th Congress of CCP. Hopefully after 16 October next month. Hopefully a little bit relaxed. Otherwise,
we are
able to China.
All of us are waiting for the conference, waiting for October. Yeah. We are waiting for November. It's coming soon.
Yeah, I'll have a question for Ricky, but you can read that question and if you can answer in 2 or 3 minutes, will be great. Ricky writes questions about whether the impact pandemic consistent among the social workers from different level. So you have 4 or 5 different level of social workers, you know? You know, the senior, local grassroots level, are they, you know, be impacted differently or similar?
Well, in my research, we will focus on the grassroots social workers most. Actually, I think the impact will have much more influence on these grassroots social workers because they are the implementers, the final implementers to all the policies. Of course, they will face much more pressures than others. But actually, in some extreme situation, like at the very beginning of the breakout of the pandemic, actually the middle level or high level social work, the supervisor will also participate in this routine job without any differences. But if in terms of the very routine, like measuring the temperature things and delivery things, these kind of job are all in the grassroots social workers. That's the reason why I think they are facing the much more pressure than other level.
Yeah, there are lots of reports. Even yesterday, I have reported in Shenzhen because another lockdown. So local community, you know, have a little bit of conflict with their local social workers. You know, obviously people are not happy about the tough zero policy. But anyway, that's a good discussion so far. It's great. Thank you for the question. Thank you for the time for discussion. We're lucky to have 3 people talking about 3 different things and bring together. Great. First of all, let me say thank you to the 3 speakers sharing your research topic with us. Very interesting. It's amazing, very informative. And also thanks for Anne if you organize these webinars. And as you are the Asian Institute news event specialist. It's really great. Thank you. I will also say thank you to everybody participate this, attend this seminar, raise the questions, and start the conversation. And I will also say congratulations to Melbourne Asian Review, another great edition, 11, with a guest lecturer Mark Wong, and the forthcoming will be another edition. Is fascinating too. So Melbourne Asian Review is a new journey, a new journal with a quite fascinating, not very long, but a very short, very covered ongoing issues in our immediate neighbors. So congratulations. Thank you, everybody, and thank you for attending this seminar. Okay, thank you.